Sherlock Holmes and the Red-Headed League. Chapter 1. The Man Who Never Was. It was a particularly dull afternoon when the matter of Jabez Wilson was first brought to our attention. Holmes and I had been sitting in our Baker Street lodgings, he with his pipe smouldering idly in his fingers, and I with the latest edition of the Times folded in my lap. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the window panes, and the fog outside thickened into an impenetrable shroud, as was common in London during this season. Holmes had spent the last hour in an almost catatonic state of observation, reclining with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his hawk-like gaze fixed upon the ceiling. I had learned by now that these were the moments when his mind was most active, sifting through the great web of criminal affairs that pervaded our city. It was at this moment that Mrs. Hudson entered, her face etched with a look of unease. "There's a man to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, glancing back toward the doorway as if uncertain whether she should have admitted him at all. "He says it's of the utmost urgency, though I can't say he looks the part of a desperate man." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Oh, and what, pray, does this mysterious figure look like, Mrs. Hudson?" She hesitated before replying, "Well, sir, I can hardly describe him at all." This curious remark prompted Holmes to rise at once. "Hardly describe him? Surely you have some impression of him?" Mrs. Hudson shook her head. "That's just it, sir. I remember opening the door. I remember him speaking. But when I try to think of his face or what he was wearing," she shuddered, "it's as if he's slipped from my mind entirely." Holmes shot me a glance, his expression sharpened with interest. How extraordinary! By all means, let us meet this most forgettable visitor. Mrs. Hudson stepped aside, allowing a short, stout man with a shock of fiery red hair to step into the room. He was well dressed but slightly dishevelled, his waistcoat buttoned unevenly, and his boots still damp from the rain. Yet what struck me most about him was the immediate sense of familiarity that I could not place, as though I had seen his face before in some forgotten dream. He cleared his throat, removing his hat. "Mr. Holmes, my name is Jabez Wilson, and I require your assistance in a matter of the strangest kind." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite us. "Pray take a seat, Mr. Wilson. You have my full attention." Wilson settled into the chair, running a hand over his forehead as though to steady himself. "It concerns an organization known as the Red-Headed League." Holmes and I exchanged glances. I had heard of no such organization, but Holmes' interest was immediately piqued. "Go on," Holmes encouraged. Wilson leaned forward. "I was employed by them, you see, under most peculiar circumstances. But as of this morning, the Red-Headed League no longer exists." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers pressed together. "A rather dramatic claim, Mr. Wilson. I assume you have proof." Wilson swallowed. "The proof, Mr. Holmes, is that no one remembers it ever existing at all." A hush fell over the room. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows with restless insistence. Holmes' eyes glittered with something between amusement and deep consideration. "Mr. Wilson, you are either the victim of an elaborate deception or—" he paused, his gaze flickering to me for the briefest moment, "or something far more unusual is at play here." Wilson let out a breath. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, the League was real. I worked there for weeks, and now—" his voice wavered, his hands curling into fists. "No records, no address, and the people who hired me, it's as if they never existed." Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. "Tell me everything, Mr. Wilson. Leave out no detail, however small." The fire crackled, casting long shadows against the walls. As Wilson began his account, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to embark on an investigation unlike any other, a mystery that did not merely challenge logic, but sought to unravel the very nature of reality itself. "Holmes, ever the rationalist, would seek the truth. But even as I listened, I felt an inexplicable unease creeping into my bones, as though we were stepping into a case that no man was ever meant to solve. Chapter 2. Jabez Wilson sat rigid in his chair, his fingers nervously tracing patterns on the brim of his hat. The firelight flickered against the sharp angles of Holmes' face, casting his features in shifting patterns of light and shadow. For a long moment he merely observed Wilson, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the silence stretching long enough for even my patience to wear thin. I cleared my throat. "Mr. Wilson, you say this red-headed league no longer exists, yet you claim to have worked for them. I assume you have some form of proof, a letter of employment, a payment receipt." Wilson let out a shaky breath and reached into his coat, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. "This," he said, his voice quivering slightly, "is the only thing left." Holmes took the paper between two fingers and unfolded it with meticulous precision. The letter was written in a bold, slanted hand on thick, yellowing paper. The Red-Headed League, founded 1597 for the betterment of men of unique coloration. To Mr. Jabez Wilson, "Sir, you are hereby employed at a salary of £4 per week. Your duties shall consist of simple clerical work, transcribing entries from the Encyclopaedia Britannica for a period of 4 hours daily. Your presence is required at 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street, effective immediately. Signed, Ezekiah Hopkins, President." Holmes' eyes flickered over the letter once, then again, before passing it to me. I could find nothing overtly peculiar about it, and yet I could not shake the feeling that there was something deeply unsettling about the very existence of such an organization. "And you say this league is gone?" Holmes asked, his voice flat. Wilson nodded. "Vanished. Disappeared as if it had never been there to begin with." Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Tell me everything from the beginning. Start with how you came to be involved with this peculiar establishment." Wilson exhaled slowly, nodding. "It was my assistant, Vincent Spaulding, who first brought it to my attention." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Your assistant? A bright young man," Wilson affirmed. "A bit too sharp for an ordinary clerk, if I'm honest. He works for half wages, though, so I didn't question it. He came to me one morning with a newspaper advertisement." Wilson fished another scrap of paper from his pocket, unfolding it with shaking hands. The newsprint was smudged, but the words remained legible. "Toady gentlemen of flame-colored hair. A unique opportunity for men of red hair, aged 21 and over. Generous remuneration for light work. Apply in person at 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street." Holmes tapped a finger against the armrest of his chair. "And what happened when you applied?" Wilson managed a weak chuckle. "Well, there was quite the crowd, I'll tell you that. Dozens of men with hair as red as mine, all eager for easy money. The line stretched down Fleet Street. When I finally got inside, I was met by a most peculiar gentleman. Duncan Ross, he called himself. Red-haired, same as me. He explained that I had been chosen due to the precise shade of my hair. I frowned. A most unusual qualification. Wilson nodded. Aye, that it was. But the work was simple, copying pages from an encyclopedia, nothing more. 4 hours a day, no distractions. They paid me promptly at the end of each week. It seemed too good to be true. Holmes' gaze darkened. "And when did it end?" Wilson's face paled. "This morning. I arrived as usual, only to find the door locked. A scrap of paper was nailed to it, just 3 words. The League dis League. No sign of Duncan Ross, no furniture inside, not even a desk. It was as if the office had never existed. I asked the landlord about it, and you know what he said." Wilson's fingers clenched around his hat. "He said that no such business had ever rented that office." A heavy silence filled the room. The fire crackled softly, but its warmth did little to dispel the creeping unease that settled over us. Holmes tapped his fingers together in measured rhythm. A most singular case. I shifted in my chair. But surely, Holmes, there must be some logical explanation. A scam, perhaps. A ruse to occupy Mr. Wilson while some greater crime was committed elsewhere. Holmes nodded slowly. Perhaps, but there is one element that unsettles me more than all the rest. He turned the letter over, studying the paper closely. Then, without a word, he held it toward the firelight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ink began to fade. The name, Ezekiah Hopkins, vanished first, followed by the words Red-Headed League. Within moments, the entire document had become a blank sheet of paper. I inhaled sharply. What in God's name? Holmes merely smiled, though his eyes betrayed something colder, something unsettled. Tell me, Mr. Wilson, have you ever seen your assistant, Vincent Spaulding, in a mirror? Wilson blinked. What kind of question is that? Holmes rose abruptly, reaching for his coat. Watson, grab your hat. We are going to Fleet Street. And with that, he strode toward the door, leaving me with the distinct sensation that we had just stepped beyond the realm of ordinary logic into something far more sinister. Chapter 3. The hansom cab rattled through the fog-drenched streets of London, the gas lamps casting wavering pools of light that did little to penetrate the heavy gloom. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression betraying neither excitement nor concern, and yet I knew my friend well enough to recognize the fierce calculation taking place beneath that composed exterior. Jabez Wilson sat beside me, his hands wringing his hat with nervous energy. "You don't think I'm mad, do you, Mr. Holmes?" he asked hesitantly. "I swear to you, the League was real. I worked there. I took wages from their hand." Holmes regarded him with an unreadable gaze. Madness, Mr. Wilson, is a word often used when the truth refuses to conform to one's expectations. I do not think you mad. I think you are a man caught in the wake of something you do not yet comprehend. Wilson swallowed, and I noticed the faint tremor in his fingers. He had the look of a man who had begun to doubt his own past. The cab turned sharply onto Fleet Street, and moments later we arrived at the location Wilson had described -7 Pope's Court, or at least where it should have been. Holmes stepped out first, his eyes scanning the row of narrow buildings. I followed, glancing around with growing unease. Fleet Street was as I remembered it, bustling even at this late hour, the air thick with the scent of ink and damp cobblestones. But something was off. "Where is it?" Wilson whispered, stepping forward hesitantly. It should be right here." I turned sharply, looking from one side of the street to the other. The numbers above the doors counted in proper sequence -5, 6, 8, 9. 7 was missing. I turned to Holmes, expecting some remark of incredulity or skepticism, but he was studying the brick wall between numbers 6 and 8 with great intensity. He took 3 steps forward, then placed his palm flat against the surface. Wilson stared in horror. It was here. I know it was here. There was a wooden sign, the Red-Headed League, right above the door. I sat inside that office for weeks. Holmes withdrew his magnifying glass and ran it over the wall, his expression tightening. Then, reaching into his coat, he produced a small vial of powder, sprinkling a thin layer over the bricks. The dust settled, and then something happened that made my breath catch. For the briefest moment, I saw it. A door. It flickered in and out of existence like a mirage on the horizon, the faint outline of a frame appearing beneath the dust before vanishing once more. Holmes' jaw tightened. "Watson, tell me what you see." I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. I thought I saw a door, but it's gone. Wilson grasped at his thinning red hair. "Dear God, what is happening?" Holmes remained silent, his gaze dark. Then, turning abruptly, he addressed a passing newspaper boy. "You, lad, have you ever noticed a business at number 7 Pope's Court?" The boy furrowed his brow. "Number 7, sir." "Ain't no number 7. Holmes pulled a shilling from his pocket and flipped it toward him. "Are you certain?" The boy bit the coin, then shrugged. "I've delivered papers here every morning for 2 years. If there was a number 7, I'd know about it." Holmes nodded and turned away. I could see it in his face now, not confusion but certainty. "We are being watched, Watson," he murmured under his breath, "and I do not like it." I stiffened. "By whom?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned back to Wilson, his expression softer than before. "Mr. Wilson, I must ask you to return home for now. You are in no immediate danger, but I need time to understand the nature of what we are facing." Wilson swallowed hard. "And what exactly are we facing, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes glanced once more at the empty space where a door had once been. Then, with a quiet intensity, he said, "Something that does not wish to be remembered." Chapter 4. The cab ride back to Baker Street was taken in silence. Holmes stared out the window, his fingers idly tapping against his knee. I knew this habit well. It meant his mind was working at a relentless pace, unraveling possibilities with every turn of the wheels beneath us. Jabez Wilson had been reluctant to leave, his protests bordering on desperation, but Holmes had assured him that returning to his shop was the safest course of action for the time being. Wilson had departed with a troubled expression, casting frequent glances over his shoulder as if fearful that he, too, might soon vanish. As for myself, I could not shake the uneasy sensation that had settled deep within my bones. It was not merely the strangeness of the case, the lead dissolving overnight, the missing door, the boy who had never seen a number 7 on Pope's Court. No, it was something far subtler, something I could not quite place. Perhaps it was the way the gaslights flickered as we passed beneath them, or the way the fog thickened around us, pressing close like unseen hands. Perhaps it was the distinct feeling that we were being watched. The moment we arrived at 221B Baker Street, Holmes threw off his coat and strode directly to the shelves where he kept his more obscure volumes. His fingers skimmed over the spines before selecting a thick tome bound in fading green leather. I removed my own coat more slowly, watching as he flipped through the pages with practiced speed. "Holmes, you must admit, this case is unlike any other we've faced." He did not look up. "Unquestionably." I took a seat by the fire. "And yet you remain unshaken. Are you not disturbed by the sheer impossibility of what we witnessed tonight?" Holmes paused, his finger resting on a page. He met my gaze with the ghost of a smile. "My dear Watson, the impossible does not exist, only that which has not yet been sufficiently examined." He turned the book toward me. Across the page was an ink drawing of a sigil, an intricate circular pattern filled with overlapping symbols. Beneath it, in bold lettering, was a single name: The Order of Elias. I frowned. I confess I have never heard of them. Holmes leaned back, tapping the open book with a single finger. "Few have. And those who have," he trailed off, then added with the faintest hint of amusement, "tend to forget." A shiver ran down my spine. "The Order of Elias," he continued, "is rumored to be one of the oldest clandestine societies in existence. Unlike the Freemasons or the Illuminati, their influence is not political, nor is it financial. Their domain, Watson, is memory itself." I scoffed. "Memory? Surely you do not mean to suggest. Consider what we have observed." Holmes cut me off, his voice sharp. "A man employed by an organization that no longer exists. A building that cannot be seen. A door that flickers in and out of reality. Witnesses who, when questioned, recall nothing at all. I exhaled slowly. And you believe this order is responsible? Holmes closed the book. I believe we are dealing with an entity that operates beyond conventional means. What remains to be seen is why they have taken an interest in a pawnbroker of no particular importance. A sharp knock at the door interrupted my reply. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. It was nearly midnight. Mrs. Hudson would not have permitted a visitor at this hour unless the matter was dire. Holmes rose smoothly and crossed the room, opening the door to reveal a man standing in the dimly lit hallway. He was tall and well-dressed in a charcoal grey coat, his gloves pristine despite the dampness of the streets. But it was his face that caused my breath to hitch, or rather the lack of it. I do not mean that the man was without features. He had eyes, a nose, a mouth, and yet in that moment I could not describe them. The instant I attempted to fix any detail in my mind, it slipped away like water through my fingers. Holmes, I noticed, did not blink. "Mr. Holmes," the man said in a smooth, measured voice, "I believe it is time we had a conversation." Chapter 5. The stranger stepped into the room with an effortless grace, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. The firelight flickered across his face, yet the more I tried to fix his features in my mind, the more they seemed to slip away, as if I were attempting to recall the details of a forgotten dream. Holmes, however, remained utterly still, his keen eyes locked onto the visitor with an intensity I had seldom seen. He did not gesture for the man to sit. The stranger removed his gloves with slow precision. "You are wondering, Mr. Holmes, if you have seen me before?" Holmes arched an eyebrow. "I have already deduced that I have not." A flicker of amusement passed over the man's unreadable face. "And yet, even as you say that, you find it difficult to be certain." Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw the faintest tightening of his jaw. I swallowed, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Sir, you have come at an unusual hour. If you have business, state it plainly." The man turned toward me, and for the briefest moment I had the distinct impression that he had no face at all, that beneath the dim light of the gas lamps his features were nothing but a vague impression of what a man should be. Then he blinked, and the illusion was gone. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small black envelope, placing it delicately on the table between us. "There are forces at work here that neither of you can fully comprehend," he said, his voice steady. "You have begun pulling at threads that must remain undisturbed. This is your only warning." Holmes studied him in silence for a long moment. Then, with an exhalation of breath that was almost bored, he reached forward and picked up the envelope. He turned it over, examining the wax seal, a sigil that matched the one we had seen in the Order of Elias. He glanced at the stranger, and if I choose to disregard this warning, the stranger's expression did not change. "Then you will cease to exist." A log cracked in the fireplace, the sound unnervingly sharp in the stillness of the room. Holmes let the envelope rest between his fingers. "How fascinating! And tell me, does this erasure happen at once, or does one simply fade, piece by piece, until there is nothing left?" The stranger regarded him coolly. "You assume that the answer matters." Holmes smiled. "Every answer matters." The man exhaled softly, as if disappointed. "You are not an easy man to dissuade, Mr. Holmes." Holmes tapped the envelope against his palm. "Nor am I a man who reacts kindly to vague threats." The stranger tilted his head slightly, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something unnatural in the way his shadow stretched across the wall, longer than it should have been, moving in ways that did not match the flickering of the firelight. Then, just as suddenly, it was normal again. He gave the smallest nod. "Then we shall meet again." Without another word, he turned and stepped toward the door. But as I moved to follow, something inexplicable occurred. something that sent a chill through my very bones. I blinked, and he was gone. The door had never opened. There was no sound of footsteps on the stair. The air had not shifted. He had simply ceased to be. Holmes rose to his feet at once, crossing the room in 3 swift strides. He pulled the door open and peered out into the hallway. Empty. The gas lamps flickered, casting their steady glow over the landing. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment before quietly closing the door. I found my voice, though it felt thin in my throat. "Holmes, what did we just witness?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he cracked the wax seal on the black envelope and withdrew a single slip of parchment. The note was written in elegant, careful script. "Mr. Holmes, you are already forgetting." A slow silence filled the room. Holmes stared at the paper for several long seconds. Then, to my utter shock, he turned it over, frowning. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. "Watson," he murmured, "what was I just holding?" I felt my stomach drop. I had no answer. Chapter 6. Holmes stood perfectly still, the slip of parchment still resting between his fingers. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across his sharp features, but for once his expression was unreadable. He turned the paper over again, his gaze narrowing. "Watson, what did I just read?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. A pressure settled against my temples, as though my mind was straining against an invisible force. I had seen the writing on the page mere seconds ago. Black ink, careful script, something urgent. Yet even as I tried to recall the exact words, I found myself grasping at nothing but mist. Holmes' grip on the paper tightened. He flicked his gaze toward me, sharp as a blade. "Watson." I swallowed. I don't know. The moment the admission left my lips, something in the room shifted. The walls, the air itself, seemed to press inward. The fire's light dimmed ever so slightly, though the flames had not diminished. A terrible thought crept into my mind. Had the note ever existed at all? Holmes moved swiftly, crossing the room and dropping the paper onto his desk. He withdrew his magnifying glass, running it over the parchment with measured precision. His fingers, usually so steady, hesitated for the briefest moment. "Watson, describe this paper to me." I forced myself to focus. "It's an ordinary sheet, fine parchment, thick. And yet you cannot recall the message upon it." I shook my head. "Nor can you." Holmes' expression darkened. Curious. He reached for a fresh piece of paper and a fountain pen. "Describe the man who delivered this to us." I hesitated. He was tall, well-dressed, but his face... A bolt of cold realization struck me. I could not picture it. It was as if the details had been wiped away, leaving only the vaguest impression of a presence. Holmes tapped the pen against the paper, his jaw tightening. "We are not simply dealing with an adversary of great influence, Watson. We are dealing with an entity capable of removing evidence, not only from the world, but from memory itself." I exhaled slowly, running a hand over my face. "This is madness, Holmes. How can one fight an enemy who can erase the very clues we need to uncover them?" Holmes' lips curled into a humorless smile. "By being clever enough to remember what they want us to forget." Without another word, he opened a drawer and withdrew a small vial of ink mixed with iron filings. "The trick I once encountered in an obscure monograph on invisible inks," he muttered. He dipped his pen into the solution and on the blank slip of parchment wrote a single sentence. "If they erase the ink, let the iron remember." He waited. We both did. And then, before my very eyes, the ink faded. I sucked in a breath. Holmes. He lifted the parchment, tilting it toward the firelight. A slow smile crossed his lips. The words remained, not in ink, but in the faintest shadow of residue, the iron particles clinging to the paper where the letters had once been. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming. "They may erase words, Watson, but they cannot erase what has already left an impression." A chill ran down my spine. And what do we do now? Holmes folded the paper neatly and placed it into the inner pocket of his coat. "Now, my dear Watson, we go to the one place where even they cannot remove history." I frowned. "And where might that be?" Holmes' smile widened. "The British Library." Chapter 7. The hansom cab rattled through the midnight streets of London, cutting through thick banks of fog that curled around the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. The city was unusually silent. No drunken revellers, no distant clatter of hooves, just the steady clip of our driver urging the horse onward. Holmes sat beside me, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood of his cane, his thoughts clearly spinning into ever-tightening threads of deduction. The iron-infused parchment lay safely tucked in his coat, a small but crucial safeguard against whatever force had attempted to wipe our memories clean. I shifted uncomfortably. "Holmes, forgive my skepticism, but are we truly to believe that an entire organization, this Order of Ilias, possesses the means to alter recorded history?" Holmes exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the chill air. "No, Watson, not history itself, merely the perception of it." I frowned. "A distinction without a difference, surely." "On the contrary, my dear fellow, a book misplaced is not a book unwritten. A letter burned is not a letter unread. The truth does not cease to exist simply because one cannot recall it." His words did little to reassure me. Moments later, we arrived at the towering structure of the British Library, its vast stone facade rising against the night like an ancient sentinel. The great iron gates were closed, but Holmes did not so much as hesitate before rapping smartly against the smaller service entrance. A long pause, then the sound of bolts being drawn back. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a pair of keen, spectacled eyes. "Mr. Holmes," the man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Harrow, apologies for the hour." The door opened wider, and I caught sight of the man properly, thin, bookish, wrapped in a woolen coat that had seen better days. Despite the late hour, his expression was one of quiet, simmering intrigue. Harrow stepped aside. "I assume you are here about the Red-Headed League." A jolt of surprise ran through me. I turned to Holmes, who merely smiled. "Ah, Watson, it seems our adversaries are not as thorough as they believe." Harrow gestured us inside, closing the door swiftly behind us. "Follow me. We should not linger in the open." We followed him through a maze of corridors, our footsteps muffled by thick rugs. The air inside was heavy with the scent of parchment and ink, a quiet sanctuary from the shifting reality we had begun to uncover. At last, we entered a small reading room where a series of books and loose documents lay strewn across a heavy oak table. Harrow motioned for us to sit before carefully closing the door. "I knew someone would come eventually," he said, rubbing his temples as he took a seat across from us. "I just wasn't sure if it would be one of them or someone trying to stop them." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me what you know." Harrow sighed, adjusting his glasses. "The Red-Headed League was never a real organization, at least, not in the way Mr. Wilson believed. It was a fabrication, a distraction. But its name appears in scattered records dating back centuries. No official ledgers, no newspapers, but in private letters, coded messages, and forgotten ledgers, always appearing and disappearing, as though rewritten at the whims of history itself." I shook my head. "Then what purpose did it serve?" Harrow hesitated. "That is where things become difficult to explain." Holmes gestured for him to continue. Harrow swallowed, his voice lowering. "There are certain individuals, certain minds, who retain information, even when it is meant to be erased, not deliberately, not through force of will, but by some innate flaw in the process. These individuals become anomalies, inconveniences, and when that happens, the order intervenes. A chill passed through me. And what happens to them? Harrow hesitated before replying. They are removed, not just from positions of influence or from society, but from memory itself. I stiffened. Holmes remained perfectly still. How many? Harrow gave a humorless chuckle. That's the question, isn't it? How does one count the forgotten? For a moment, silence filled the room. The very air felt heavier. Holmes finally spoke. Then you believe Mr. Wilson is one such anomaly? Harrow nodded. Yes, the League was never about employing him. It was about observing him, studying whether his mind could be rewritten like the others. When they realized it could not, they dissolved the League and began the process of erasing it from existence. A terrible thought occurred to me. Then Wilson himself. Harrow pressed his lips into a thin line. Maybe next. The air in the room seemed to constrict. Holmes rose abruptly, his coat flaring as he turned toward the door. We must return to Wilson at once. Harrow stood as well. If the order has already moved against him, it may be too late. Holmes' gaze darkened. Then let us ensure it is not. Without another word, he strode toward the exit, and we followed, into the cold, vanishing night. Chapter 8. The cab raced through the damp streets of London, the night wind howling against the windows as we sped towards Saxe-Coburg Square. The city, usually alive even in the late hours, felt eerily silent. Only the occasional glint of gas lamps and the distant echoes of footsteps broke the hush. Holmes sat forward, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his fingers tapping impatiently against the handle of his cane. Beside him, Mr. Harrow sat rigid, his lips pressed into a thin line. I gripped the edge of the seat. Holmes, if what Harrow says is true, if Wilson is truly being erased, then how do we stop something we cannot see? Holmes' voice was calm, but edged with something I rarely heard from him, urgency. By finding an anchor, Watson, something that proves he existed. The words sent a shiver through me. It was a dreadful thought, but I could not shake the fear that we might already be too late. The cab jolted to a stop in front of Wilson's pawnshop. The street was utterly still. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting pale, ghostly light over the storefront. We stepped out swiftly, Holmes leading the way. The shop's wooden sign, once bearing Jabez Wilson, pawnbroker, hung above the door. But the name was gone. I took a sharp breath. The lettering had been stripped away as if the wood had never been carved in the first place. The glass window, where once there had been dusty trinkets and watches on display, was now completely empty. Not shattered, not removed, just blank. Harrow muttered under his breath. It started. Holmes pushed open the door, the bell above it giving a feeble chime. The shop was dark. The shelves, once cluttered with second-hand goods, were bare. The counter where Wilson had stood just that morning was covered in a thin layer of dust, as though untouched for years. A sinking feeling coiled in my stomach. Holmes strode forward, his movements sharp and controlled. "Wilson," he called, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. No response. Harrow stepped past me, his hands curling into fists. "Check upstairs," he muttered. We moved quickly, our footsteps the only sound in the vacant building. The door to Wilson's living quarters was slightly ajar. Holmes pushed it open without hesitation. The room was as it had been earlier, plain, modest, with an old wooden chair and a writing desk in the corner. But the bed was empty, and there was no sign of Jabez Wilson. A slow chill crept up my spine. Holmes. But he was already moving, scanning the room with keen eyes. He paused at the writing desk, his fingers brushing over the wood. Then he turned to me. "Watson, tell me, what did Wilson look like?" I opened my mouth to answer. Stopped. An icy realization struck me. I could remember his red hair. I could remember his voice, the way he wrung his hat in his hands when nervous. But his face. My mind grasped at a void. I took a step back, feeling the breath leave my lungs. Dear God. Harrow swore under his breath. It's happening faster than I thought. Holmes' expression was unreadable, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not yet." He reached into his coat and withdrew the iron-inked parchment, the only thing we had that resisted inertia. He held it up to the dim candlelight. The words remained faint but visible. "If they erase the ink, let the iron remember." Holmes exhaled. "There is still time." He turned sharply to Harrow. "Do you have records of Wilson's business license?" Harrow's expression was grim. "I did. But if he's being erased, those records will be altered too." Holmes nodded. "Then we must find something more permanent, something older than their reach." I swallowed, gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself. "And what, pray, is older than a force that can erase a man's very existence?" Holmes turned toward the door, his coat billowing behind him. "A grave," he said simply. We followed without hesitation, stepping back into the cold, vanishing night. Chapter 9. The cemetery loomed before us like a forgotten relic, its iron gates twisted with age, its gravestones rising from the damp earth like fractured teeth. The fog had thickened as we approached, coiling around the tombstones and muffling all sound save for the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. Holmes moved swiftly, his lantern casting sharp, shifting shadows across the stone markers. Beside him, Harrow scanned the rows of graves with an anxious energy, his breath visible in the frigid air. I brought up the rear, my pulse drumming against my temples. It was a mad idea. Yet I could not shake the dreadful certainty that Holmes was right. If Jabez Wilson was being erased, if history itself was being rewritten, then our only hope lay in something older than memory itself, a record that could not be altered because it was carved in stone. Holmes halted abruptly before a weathered headstone, running his gloved fingers over the cold marble. "Here," he murmured. Harrow and I stepped closer, peering at the inscription beneath the layers of lichen and grime. Jabez Wilson, 1841, 1891. A gust of wind swept through the graveyard, rattling the brittle branches above us. I swallowed hard. This can't be right. Wilson isn't dead. Holmes said nothing. Harrow took a sharp step forward, his expression darkening. "No, this isn't Erasure. This is something else." I tore my gaze from the inscription, glancing between them. "What are you saying?" Harrow clenched his jaw. "They don't just erase people, Watson. Sometimes they reassign them." A slow, horrible realization crept over me. "You mean they change how history remembers them?" Holmes' voice was grim. "Precisely." A sick feeling curled in my gut. "But why?" Holmes straightened, his eyes reflecting the flickering lantern light. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must uncover before we, too, are altered beyond recognition." He reached into his pocket and withdrew his notepad, quickly sketching the exact dimensions of the gravestone and noting the details of its placement. "We must move quickly," he said, "before they realize what we've found." Harrow exhaled sharply. "If this is real, if the Order truly has the ability to rewrite the past, then we're up against something far more dangerous than I feared." I turned back to the grave, my mind reeling. The fog swirled around us, thickening like the folds of an old, forgotten curtain. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Holmes was still holding the lantern. Harrow was beside me. No one else was present. Yet there were 4 shadows on the ground. Chapter 10. The fog curled around our feet, thick as a burial shroud. The lantern in Holmes' hand flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the uneven ground. 3 of them belonged to us. The 4th did not. My breath hitched. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, for some explanation, but I found none. I turned sharply, my eyes darting into the empty space beside me. No one was there, yet the shadow stretched on the ground, standing motionless, watching. Holmes moved first. With a flick of his wrist, he lifted the lantern, tilting it to shift the angle of the light. Shadows should have shifted, lengthened, twisted. The 4th one did not. Harrow swore under his breath. We need to leave. Now. Holmes, however, remained eerily calm. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the unnatural silhouette. It seems, he murmured, we are being observed. I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out thin. Holmes, this isn't. The shadow moved. Not in the way a shadow should. It did not stretch or bend according to the light. Instead, it flickered, as if adjusting itself to reality. Holmes did not flinch. Watson, Harrow, stepped back. Harrow needed no encouragement. I followed instinctively, though my mind fought to make sense of the impossibility before us. The shadow remained where it was for a moment longer. Then it stepped forward. I grabbed Holmes' arm. Holmes, for the love of God. The shadow took another step. And then the lantern went out. Darkness, a void so absolute I could not see my own hands. I spun, reaching blindly for Holmes, for Harrow, for anything solid. But the silence that followed was deeper than sound. I heard nothing, not even my own breath. Then a whisper, a voice, low, layered, inhuman. You were not meant to remember. My pulse slammed against my ribs. The voice wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere. Turn back. The sharp pressure filled my skull, as though someone was peeling apart the edges of my thoughts. I gritted my teeth, fighting the pull, the unnatural force clawing at my memories. And then light. The lantern flared back to life. The fog had cleared. The cemetery was silent once more. Holmes stood exactly where he had been, his expression unreadable. Harrow was rigid beside me, his breathing ragged. And the shadow was gone. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Holmes, in a voice as steady as ever, said, I believe we have overstayed our welcome. Chapter 11. The silence followed us as we left the cemetery, clinging to us like the mist curling through the narrow streets of London. Even the usual sounds of the city, the distant clatter of carriages, the occasional shout of a night watchman, felt strangely muted, as though the world itself recoiled from what we had just witnessed. Holmes walked with purpose, his coat billowing slightly as he led the way through the fog-laden streets. Harrow and I followed, though I had the distinct impression that something else might be following us. I did not dare look over my shoulder. We did not speak until we reached Baker Street. The familiar sight of 221B brought a wash of relief, but it was a hollow comfort. As we stepped inside, Mrs. Hudson peered at us from the corridor, her brow furrowed. You've been gone for hours, she said quietly. I was beginning to worry. Holmes offered her a small nod. Fear not, Mrs. Hudson. We are unharmed. She frowned, gaze lingering on each of us. Unharmed, perhaps, but pale as ghosts, the lot of you. Holmes did not respond. Instead, he strode toward the sitting room, gesturing for Harrow and me to follow. The fire was still burning, but the warmth did little to drive the cold from my bones. Holmes removed his coat, draping it over the back of his chair before retrieving his notebook from the desk. He flipped through the pages with swift efficiency, pausing only when he reached the sketches he had made of Wilson's headstone. Then, at last, he spoke. Something very peculiar is happening, gentlemen. We have encountered forces capable of erasing names, locations, and even memories. We have seen a shadow that should not exist, heard a voice that did not belong to this world, and stood before the grave of a man who was never meant to die. Harrow exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And yet Wilson is still gone. Holmes' fingers tapped lightly against the notebook. Yes, but we now know where he has been placed within history. The next question is why? I leaned forward. You suspect there's a pattern to these erasures. Not erasures, Holmes corrected. Reassignments. Wilson was not erased. He was rewritten. If we can determine what purpose he now serves in this altered history, we may begin to understand the true scope of the Order's influence. I frowned. But how do we trace a man who, for all intents and purposes, has already lived and died? Holmes' gaze flickered with something cold and calculating. By finding someone who remembers him before the world forgets them too. The words settled heavily between us. Harrow stood abruptly. You're saying there are more? Holmes closed his notebook with a quiet snap. I would wager that Wilson is not the first, nor will he be the last. I ran a hand over my face. Holmes, this is madness. If they truly possess the power to rewrite history itself. Then we are already working against time, Holmes interrupted smoothly. The longer we wait, the more history reshapes itself. We must find another anomaly, someone who has slipped through the cracks, someone whose memories still resist alteration. Harrow's jaw tightened. And where, exactly, do you propose we find such a person? Holmes leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly. Then, without hesitation, he said, in the one place where truth lingers longest, a madhouse. Chapter 12. The carriage rattled through the fog-drenched streets, its wheels carving shallow grooves into the damp earth. The journey to Brookwood Asylum was undertaken in silence. Even Holmes, usually inclined towards some form of deduction or analysis during our travels, sat in contemplative stillness, his hands steepled beneath his chin. Harrow had said little since we departed, his expression unreadable beneath the dim glow of the carriage lamps. I could not blame him. The notion that men and women could be rewritten, that their very existence could be reshaped, was a horror beyond words. The lantern swayed as we passed beneath the looming iron gates. The sign, Brookwood Institution for the Mentally Afflicted, was rusted at the edges, the paint peeling like dead skin. The very sight of it sent an uncomfortable prickle across my skin. The asylum itself was a squat, grey structure, its barred windows peering out into the darkness like hollow eyes. The building had an oppressive quality, its walls seeming to press inward against the night. A figure awaited us at the entrance. Dr. Elias Grayson, Brookwood's chief physician, stood with a lantern in hand, his expression carefully neutral. He was a thin, pale man with greying temples and sharp, inquisitive eyes. Holmes stepped forward, extending a gloved hand. Dr. Grayson, I presume. The man hesitated a fraction too long before shaking it. Mr. Holmes, your letter was most peculiar. I find that most truths are, Holmes replied smoothly. Grayson's gaze flickered toward Harrow and myself before he gestured for us to follow. You requested to see a patient who, by all accounts, should not exist. I must warn you, Mr. Holmes, what you are about to witness is not something easily understood. Holmes merely inclined his head, and we stepped inside. The halls of Brookwood were filled with an unnatural hush, broken only by the distant creak of old wood and the occasional murmur of the wind against the barred windows. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp stone. Dr. Grayson led us deeper into the asylum, past heavy iron doors and dimly lit corridors. Finally, we reached a reinforced cell at the far end of the ward. The door was thick oak, reinforced with iron rivets. A small observation window sat at eye level, covered by a sliding panel. This is him, Grayson said quietly. I advise caution. Holmes stepped forward, his hand steady as he slid the panel open. I leaned in beside him, and for the second time that night my breath caught in my throat. The man inside sat on the edge of a cot, rocking slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides. His hair was red, the same exact shade as Jabez Wilson's. His beard was overgrown, his clothes tattered. But it was his eyes that unsettled me most. They were wide, unfocused, darting across the walls as though tracking things unseen. Holmes exhaled softly. "What is his name?" Dr. Grayson hesitated before replying. "That is a difficult question, Mr. Holmes. He has given many names, but none that seem to hold." Harrow stepped forward. "Then what is he called in your records?" Grayson's lips parted, but he did not answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thin folder. He opened it to the front page, turning it toward us. There, scrawled in fading ink, was a single line. "Patient 237. Name. Redact." A cold silence filled the space. Holmes' eyes did not leave the file. "You see it too, do you not?" Dr. Grayson swallowed. "See what?" Holmes' voice was calm, yet edged with something dark. "The ink," he said, tilting the folder toward the light. "It has been altered." I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. The ink beneath redact was faint, almost erased, but I could make out the lingering impressions beneath it. Letters that had once existed, now barely visible. A name. Jabez Wilson. Harrow muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Grayson paled. This is impossible." Holmes closed the folder with a soft snap. "I assure you, Doctor, it is anything but." From within the cell, the man on the cot stopped rocking, his head tilted slightly. And then, without warning, he spoke. "They won't let you leave." The words were hoarse, cracked from disuse. I stiffened. "Who won't let us leave?" The man's gaze lifted for the first time. He looked directly at Holmes. "The ones you can't remember." Chapter 13. The room fell into an unnatural silence. The firelight flickered against the damp stone walls, casting shifting shadows over the man who had once been Jabez Wilson. His hollow eyes remained fixed on Holmes, unblinking, as though peering past him into something none of us could see. Holmes was the first to break the silence. His voice was level, calculated. "Tell me, Mr. Wilson, who are they?" The man on the cot twitched. His lips parted, but for a moment no sound came. Then, in a whisper, he muttered, "The order." Harrow took a slow step closer, his posture tense. "What do they want?" Wilson let out a dry, rasping chuckle. "They want the same thing they've always wanted, to correct mistakes." I frowned. "What mistakes?" Wilson's fingers twitched, tapping lightly against the cot's edge in a rhythmic pattern. "The ones who remember." Holmes' expression darkened. "You mean anomalies. People like yourself, those whose memories resist alteration." Wilson's gaze darted toward the door as if expecting something or someone to appear. They try to fix things. When a name doesn't vanish like it should, when a face lingers too long in the minds of others, they correct it. The chill ran through me. And how did they correct it? Wilson's fingers stopped tapping. Slowly, he lifted his hands, pressing his palms against his temples. "They take pieces of you, a word here, a memory there, bit by bit." And then one day his breath hitched. "You wake up and find yourself in a place like this, with a name that isn't yours and a past that never was." A heavy silence followed. Holmes remained perfectly still. "You were saying they rewrite history selectively, removing only what they deem necessary." Wilson let out a slow exhale. "Not just history. People." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. My mind reeled at the implications. How many had been altered? How many had disappeared from the world's collective memory? And how close were we to suffering the same fate? Holmes turned to Dr. Grayson, his voice sharp. How long has he been here? Grayson hesitated. Officially, 3 years. Unofficially. A pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Grayson said, I don't know. I don't even remember admitting him. My blood ran cold. Holmes' expression darkened. Then we are already too late. Wilson tensed. His eyes flickered toward the far wall. They know you're here. Harrow stiffened. Who? Wilson's breath came faster. He lurched forward, gripping Holmes' wrist with surprising strength. You have to leave. You've seen too much. You're going to forget soon. They won't let you leave as you are. I grabbed his shoulder. Wilson. The lights flickered. The distant noise echoed through the corridors, a sound that did not belong. A slow, deliberate series of footsteps. Not hurried, not hesitant. Measured. Holmes turned to Dr. Grayson. Who else is here at this hour? The doctor swallowed, his face pale. No one. Harrow reached for his revolver. Then we have a problem. Wilson's grip on Holmes tightened. His voice was barely a whisper. You were not meant to remember. The lanterns flickered again, and then the door handle began to turn. Chapter 14. The handle turned with a slow, deliberate movement, the metal groaning under the pressure. Every muscle in my body tensed, my pulse hammering as I instinctively reached for my revolver. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still. His eyes never left the door, his mind undoubtedly calculating every possible course of action. Harrow stood rigid beside me, his grip tightening on his own weapon. Wilson trembled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It's too late, he whispered. They've come. The door swung open. The figure standing beyond it was featureless. A tall man in an immaculate black coat, his hat tilted forward just enough to obscure the finer details of his face. But it wasn't a lack of light that made him unreadable. It was as if his features refused to exist. My mind scrambled to assign details to him, to define the curve of a cheekbone, the color of his eyes, but it was like grasping at smoke. The more I tried to focus, the less I saw. He stepped inside without a word. Holmes did not flinch. His voice was calm, measured. And whom do I have the pleasure of addressing? The man tilted his head slightly. The movement was too precise, too calculated. Wrong. When he spoke, his voice was layered, as if more than one person was speaking at once. There is no need for names, Mr. Holmes. A ripple of cold dread ran through me. Holmes, to his credit, remained unfazed. I would disagree. Names are rather important in our line of work. They allow one to exist after all. The man took a slow step forward. Existence is a fragile thing. It must be carefully maintained. Holmes let out a small breath, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides. Yes, I imagine your order is quite experienced in maintenance. A faint whisper seemed to stir the air, the sound of something being forgotten. The man in black took another step forward, unhurried. You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes. This is not your case. Holmes smiled. And yet here we are. Harrow shifted beside me, his knuckles white. What do you want? The man ignored him. His gaze, or whatever approximation of a gaze he possessed, remained on Holmes. You are an inconvenience, he said simply. Your mind is resistant. A complication. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Then allow me to make matters worse. In one swift motion, he withdrew the iron-inked parchment from his coat and held it toward the figure. The paper, the only thing that had resisted their inertia, gleamed in the dim light. The air shuddered. The man in black stopped moving. A ripple passed over him, like a distortion in reality itself. Holmes' voice was dangerously soft. I assume this troubles you. The man did not respond. Holmes pressed forward. You are capable of altering memory, of rewriting records, of bending perception itself, and yet you cannot erase something that has already left an impression. The room seemed to constrict, the very walls pressing in. Holmes' eyes gleamed. You cannot erase the truth if it has been preserved. For the first time, something shifted in the man's unreadable presence. A crack in the facade. The lights flickered violently, the flames in the lanterns stretching unnaturally. Shadows contorted, twisting in directions they should not. The man in black exhaled. It was not a sigh of exhaustion, nor of frustration. It was the sound of reality bending. Then he spoke. You have seen too much. Holmes' jaw tightened. Quite. The figure lifted a gloved hand, his fingers shifting wrongly, the motion smooth and fluid, as if not bound by the same physical laws as the rest of us. Holmes moved first. Watson, now. I did not hesitate. I raised my revolver and fired. The bullet struck the man's chest and passed through him. No wound, no blood, just a brief flicker, as if he had never been entirely present to begin with. The temperature in the room plummeted. Then suddenly Wilson screamed. I spun to see him clutching his head, his eyes wide with horror. His body convulsed violently. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no sound emerged. And then he was gone. Not vanished, not teleported, erased. The cot where he had been sitting was undisturbed, the sheets smooth. The very air in the room felt as though it had never been disturbed by his presence. My throat clenched. Holmes. I know, Holmes snapped, already moving. He grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the door. Harrow with me, now. The man in black did not follow. He did not need to. As we burst into the hallway, I realized I could no longer remember the sound of Wilson's voice. The three of us sat in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, the fire burning low. Outside, the city moved on as though nothing had ever happened, as though Wilson had never existed. I stared into my teacup, the liquid still untouched. My mind was raw, my memories frayed at the edges. Already, small details were slipping. What Wilson had looked like, the way he had spoken, the precise shape of his shop. Harrow sat opposite me, his face pale. I wrote down everything I could remember, he said quietly. It's already fading. Holmes was silent. He sat in his chair, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. His face was unreadable. I hesitated. Holmes, what do we do now? He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was very quiet. Nothing. I stiffened. Nothing. But we know the truth. We have the iron-inked parchment. We cooled. Holmes exhaled. Watson, tell me. I swallowed. Tell you what? His gaze lifted to mine, sharp, assessing. Jabez Wilson, he said evenly. What did he look like? I opened my mouth. No words came. A terrible silence filled the space. Holmes gave a slow nod. Then softly he said, Some cases, Watson, are not meant to be remembered. The end.